Endurance racing isn't about being the fastest for a moment. It's about surviving for hours, sometimes for an entire day. While everything around you slowly falls apart, engines overheat, tires disintegrate, drivers push through exhaustion and darkness, rain turns the track into chaos, and yet the race never stops. For more than a century, endurance motorsports has tested not just machines, but people. Not just speed, but patience, teamwork, and resilience. And its history stretches far earlier than most people realise. To understand endurance racing, we have to go back to a time before racing even existed. In the late 19th century, automobiles were fragile, unreliable inventions. They broke down constantly. Roads were unpaved. Fuel was scarce. And simply finishing a long journey was considered an achievement. In 1894, one event would quietly change everything. The Paris-Rouen trial wasn't a race in the modern sense. There were no lap times, no checkered flags. The goal was simple: prove that a car could travel long distances without braking. That idea, that durability, mattered more than outright speed, became the foundation of endurance racing. In the early 1900s, competitions like the Gordon Bennett Cup and other long-distance road events pushed drivers across hundreds of miles of public roads. There were no pit crews. Drivers repaired their own cars mid-race. Mechanical sympathy mattered as much as bravery. If your car finished, you won respect. If it didn't, that was expected. Racing at this stage wasn't entertainment. It was experimentation. Manufacturers used these events to improve engines, brakes, tyres, and cooling systems. Endurance wasn't a category yet. It was simply survival. Everything changed in the early 1920s. In 1923, organisers in France introduced a radical concept. Instead of racing for distance or speed alone, cars would race for time. One full day. 24 continuous hours. The 24 Hours of Le Mans was born. The idea was revolutionary. Cars would race through daylight, dusk, complete darkness, and sunrise. Drivers would share the workload. Pit stops became strategic events rather than emergencies. Reliability was no longer just important, it was everything. Manufacturers embraced it immediately. Le Mans offered something no other race did: proof that a car could survive real-world conditions longer than its competitors. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, endurance racing became prestigious. Brands like Bentley, Alfa Romeo, and Bugatti built reputations not just on speed, but on toughness. But this era wasn't without danger. Tracks were narrow. Safety was minimal. Night racing was barely lit. Drivers wore goggles and leather helmets. Crashes were often fatal. Still, the races continued. Then came World War II. Racing across Europe stopped almost entirely. Tracks were damaged. Factories were repurposed for war. Drivers went to battlefields instead of circuits. When racing returned in the late 1940s, endurance motorsport became a symbol of recovery. Events like Le Mans resumed. New endurance races emerged around the world. In Italy, the Mille Miglia tested cars across 1,000 miles of public roads. In Belgium, Spa challenged drivers with long, fast forest circuits. And in the United States, endurance racing found a new home. In 1953, the 12 Hours of Sebring was held on a former military airfield. The concrete surface was brutal. Cars rattled apart. Suspensions failed. Only the toughest machines survived. Sebring quickly became America's answer to Le Mans, raw, punishing, and unforgiving. But endurance racing also faced its darkest moment. In 1955, a catastrophic accident at Le Mans killed dozens of spectators. It remains the deadliest incident in motorsport history. The tragedy forced the entire sport to confront safety in a way it never had before. Tracks were redesigned, cars evolved. Endurance racing didn't disappear, it adapted. By the 1960s, the sport entered one of its most famous eras. Ferrari dominated endurance racing, especially at Le Mans. Their cars were fast, beautiful, and successful. Then an American company decided to challenge them. Ford's mission wasn't subtle. After a failed attempt to buy Ferrari, Ford committed to beating them on the track. The Ford GT40 was built specifically to win Le Mans. It took years of development, heartbreak, and failure. But in 1966, Ford finally succeeded, finishing first, second, and third. Ford went on to win Le Mans 4 times in a row. Endurance racing had become global corporate warfare. This era also saw the rise of grand touring cars, vehicles based more closely on production models. Fans could now see race cars that resembled road cars, making endurance racing feel more relatable and more human. But the limits were about to be pushed even further. In the 1970s, endurance racing entered what many consider its wildest phase. Cars like the Porsche 917 produced enormous power with minimal restrictions. Speeds skyrocketed, safety lagged behind. Drivers raced at terrifying velocities for hours at a time. It was spectacular, it was dangerous, and it couldn't last. In the early 1980s, regulators introduced Group C, a rule set focused on fuel efficiency rather than engine size. Instead of limiting power directly, teams were given a fixed fuel allowance. The result was brilliant. Manufacturers built cars that were not only fast, but smart. Porsche, Jaguar, Mercedes, and others created some of the most iconic endurance machines ever seen. Night racing at Le Mans during this era became legendary. Glowing brake discs, turbo flames, and cars slicing through the darkness at impossible speeds. This period is often called the golden age of endurance racing. Across the Atlantic, endurance racing was evolving in its own way. In North America, the IMSA series introduced GTP cars, aggressive turbocharged prototypes that raced at Daytona and Sebring. The fields were diverse. Factory teams competed against privateers. Innovation flourished. In 1991, endurance racing delivered one of its greatest surprises. Mazda won Le Mans with a rotary-powered car, the only rotary engine ever to do so. It was a victory born of reliability, discipline, and endurance philosophy. But by the late 1990s, the sport faced another crisis. Costs exploded. Manufacturer arms races spiraled out of control. Entire classes collapsed almost overnight. GT1 disappeared. Grids shrank. Endurance racing needed reinvention once again. That reinvention came through structure and stability. In the early 2000s, Audi entered endurance racing with a clear philosophy: efficiency, reliability, and relentless execution. They dominated Le Mans for over a decade, even pioneering diesel technology at the highest level of motorsport. Prototypes were reorganized into clear classes. Private teams were given space to compete. Endurance racing stabilized. In 2012, a major milestone arrived. The World Endurance Championship was launched, unifying global endurance racing under a single banner. Hybrid technology transformed the sport. Porsche, Audi, and Toyota pushed efficiency to extraordinary levels. The cars became technological marvels, complex, fast, and incredibly reliable. For Toyota, endurance racing became a story of perseverance. After years of heartbreak and near misses, they finally won Le Mans in 2018. It was a reminder that endurance racing doesn't reward brilliance alone. It rewards persistence. By the late 2000s, costs had once again become unsustainable. Manufacturers withdrew. The future was uncertain. But endurance racing responded the way it always has. With the introduction of the hypercar regulations. In the early 2020s, the sport found new life. Costs were controlled. Design freedom returned. Cars once again resembled futuristic road machines. Ferrari returned. Porsche returned. Cadillac, BMW, Peugeot, and others joined. For the first time in decades, endurance racing thrived simultaneously in Europe and North America under shared rules. Grids grew, competition tightened, fans returned. And through all of its transformations from dirt roads to hybrid hypercars, one truth remains unchanged. Endurance racing is not about dominance, it is about survival. It is about engineers anticipating failure before it happens, drivers trusting teammates in the darkness, teams adapting when everything goes wrong. Because in endurance racing, speed fades, but endurance is forever.